My name is Ari Berman. I am a senior contributing writer for The Nation magazine and the author of the new book, Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. So it struck me as very new when I was first covering it, because I didn't see these same sort of efforts really that much before that. I mean, there had been some talk about voter ID laws. Some states had passed them prior to 2010, but not that much stuff was happening in terms of restricting voting before 2010 compared to after 2010. There were 180 new voting restrictions introduced in 41 states, according to the Brennan Center for Justice, from 2011 to 2012. And half the states in the country passed some sort of new voting restriction. So things like shutting down voter registration drives and cutting back on early voting and disenfranchising ex-felons. These were efforts that really gained a lot of momentum post-2010. And so it was both the types of voting restrictions, but it was just the fact that how broad it was, that this was happening in places like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, not just Alabama and Georgia, that made it so distinct. I think it was driven by the election of President Obama and the fear of the country's changing demographics politically. And I think it was an attempt by these Republican majorities to make the electorate older, whiter, and more conservative, like it had been during the 2010 election when Republicans did so well, as opposed to younger, more diverse, and more progressive, like it had been when Barack Obama did so well in 2008. If you looked at the constituencies that were affected by cutting back early voting or shutting down voter registration drives or requiring strict voter ID, they were younger voters, voters of color, lower income voters, women voters. These were the voters that were the key to President Obama's election. So I clearly saw it as an attempt by Republicans to try to engineer an electorate that was more in their favor. They broke down the data after 2008 and they saw who would be affected and also how the Obama campaign was so successful. The Obama campaign turned out an entirely new electorate. There were 5 million new voters in 2008, and of those 5 million new voters, 2 million were African American, 2 million were Hispanic, and 600,000 were Asian. And they voted a combined 75% for President Obama. And these were the fastest growing demographics in the country. And so basically, as an opposition party, you have two choices. You can either change your policies to reach out to those changing demographics, or you can make it harder for those people to participate in the political process if you're convinced they won't vote for you. And unfortunately, there was an effort to do the latter as opposed to reaching out to these new people. I think that there was a belief that the party was unwilling or unable to change its position. Take immigration reform, for example. Immigration reform was something that you would do if you wanted to reach out to the growing Hispanic electorate. But immigration reform never really had a realistic chance of passing, especially after 2010 when the Tea Party was so influential. So, I mean, if you know that you're not going to be able to pass immigration reform because your base doesn't support it and you're not going to get the growing Hispanic vote, then you start thinking about ways to try to diminish this group's political power. Same with African Americans. African Americans identified so strongly for President Obama and the Democratic Party. I think Republicans just didn't believe they could win these votes, so they went towards a strategy of restricting their participation. I think this was unfortunate and extremely anti-democratic, but I understand the political rationale behind it. It's not as explicit as it was in the 1960s, but there was still a fair amount of statements that led you to believe that certain things were happening. If you go back to 1980, there was a very influential conservative activist, Paul Weyrich, who was one of the founders of the Heritage Foundation and the American Legislative Exchange Council, and he said at a meeting of Christian right ministers for Ronald Reagan, "I don't want everybody to vote. Our leverage in the electorate goes up as the size of the electorate goes down." And I think that was the basic idea behind these restrictions. Now, he said this in 1980, but I think it was applicable to what was happening in 2010, which is we see when there have been smaller turnouts in the 2010 and the 2014 elections, Republicans have done much better. When there have been larger turnouts in 2008 and 2012, Obama and the Democrats have done much better. And so I think the parties just have very different theories of the game. We saw a lot of rhetoric during the 2012 election where Republicans were explicit about what these new restrictions would do. In Pennsylvania, you had a Republican legislature say that voter ID was going to allow Romney to to win that state. We had a Republican Party chair in Columbus, Ohio, say that he didn't believe that early voting should be structured to benefit African Americans. So we heard this rhetoric over and over. And we've also heard rhetoric about people believing that not that many people should participate, that philosophically the electorate is better when it's smaller, which sort of goes against the central tenets of democracy, but nonetheless is being promulgated by certain people. If you're a party that wants to make it harder for certain people to vote, you're not going to support a Voting Rights Act, because the Voting Rights Act was stopping some of these very measures in places like Texas. And so I think many of the challenges to the Voting Rights Act also occurred because all of these states now wanted to put in place these new restrictions. So you saw states like Texas, for example, states like Alabama being very aggressive in trying to challenge the Voting Rights Act. And once the Voting Rights Act was endangered, once it was challenged in 2013, and there were all these new restrictions, I became very interested in the history of the Voting Rights Act. What did it do? Why is it being challenged? I realized that no one had really written a comprehensive account of what the Voting Rights Act did. There had been so much written about the events leading up to the Voting Rights Act. What had occurred in Selma, Alabama in 1965, what had occurred in Mississippi in 1964. There was much less written about what had happened after. And I knew that it was important to tell this story for two reasons. One, because we were going to observe the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, so I knew it would be something that people were thinking about. And secondly, because we were in a whole new fight over voting, it was something that was extremely relevant today. It wasn't just a dry history that you read and you put away somewhere on your bookshelf. This is something that people are living, breathing, fighting about today. And so that made the history since 1965 very applicable to the current history that's going on right now. Well, what occurred is that the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized by the Congress 4 times. Most recently in 2006, when it was reauthorized, 390 to 33 in the House and 98 to 0 in the Senate, and signed by President George W. Bush. So opponents of the Voting Rights Act, like Ed Blum, realized that they weren't going to make any progress through legislation, that this act had strong bipartisan support in the Congress and would for a very long time. And so there was a concerted effort to get cases before the court to challenge the Voting Rights Act, knowing that the Supreme Court under Chief Justice John Roberts had moved far to the right. And so first there was a challenge brought in 2009. Chief Justice Roberts basically made his skepticism about parts of the Voting Rights Act very clear, but was unwilling at that point in time to strike them down. That really opened the floodgates. People knew that a new challenge to the Voting Rights Act would likely be successful before the court, and then there was all these new voting restrictions passed after 2010, so the effort to challenge the Voting Rights Act got a lot of momentum from places like Texas and Alabama and Georgia, and so there was both a concerted effort to challenge the Voting Rights Act in conservative circles, but then there was also a lot more backing from the states to want to do this now, because they viewed the Voting Rights Act as trying to block things that they wanted to put in place, like voter ID and cuts to early voting. Well, I think basically it was, the debate over the NAMUDNO case was largely relegated to legal circles. It was not a case that had a broad impact among the public. I think what it showed people like Ed Blum was they needed to get another case before this court as soon as possible, because Roberts was basically saying, give me another challenge, and if Congress doesn't do anything, then I will strike either Section 4 or Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act down. And Congress wasn't going to do anything because President Obama had just been elected, and there was all these other priorities. He was in the middle of an economic crisis, and they wanted to pass healthcare reform, and they wanted to pass immigration reform, and they wanted to pass climate change legislation. There were so many things on the Democratic Congress's plate. The idea of going back and looking at a piece of legislation that had just been overwhelmingly reauthorized in 2006 was crazy. So I think the Congress and the court had two very different priorities. The court is basically trying to send a signal to Congress to do something, and the Congress is saying, we just did something. We just did this in 2006. We had a year and a half of hearings. We did this. We're done with this. You should defer to us. This has been reauthorized 4 times. We found the evidence. We made a considered judgment, and you should stick by our judgment. And the court's majority clearly wasn't thinking that way.